Here I am back from vacation in the Locked On Mets studios, and we have a ton to discuss on this two-part edition of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor and where we have a lot of great trade deadline coverage for you to check out. So if you're curious about other teams in Major League Baseball, I do encourage you to check out some of the great writing we have over at Just Baseball, which is why I am so thrilled to be back for both of my jobs here, to be managing the writing staff over there at Just Baseball and to be covering the New York Mets. I was on a cross-country flight today, Los Angeles to Fort Lauderdale. A lot happened, okay? As I was getting to the airport, there was the news of Daniel Nunez hitting the IL, Adrian Hauser and Shintaro Fujinami going on or getting DFA'd. There was so much happening. Eric Orzi was up. A lot to unpack. So on today's show, we got a two-parter. First part of the show, which is going to be this episode that you're listening to, watching, Mets game recap. We're going to talk about Kodai Senga's flash of brilliance and then a re-injury. We're going to talk about all of that roster turnover and the Ryne Stanek trade. Second part of the episode that you're going to tune in after this, I hope, it's about what it looks like if the Mets go all in. Blake Snell, Michael Conforto. There's going to be a lot to discuss on that show, but we got to start with the Mets victory because it was a party at Citi Field for at least the first 5 innings and the first out, or at least the first part of the sixth, as the Mets blew out the Atlanta Braves to win their 5th straight game and to move into the first wild card seed. There was a point not that long ago that the Atlanta Braves were 10 games up on the New York Mets, and you would have thought it was crazy to think that the Mets could catch the Braves at any point this season. But the Braves haven't been winning, and the Mets have been the best team in baseball for about 2 months now, and this has led to them grabbing that first wild card spot at this stage right now. There's still the rest of this series to be played, but it's been a remarkable turnaround for your New York Mets. And it's funny because when the Mets I talked about this on the show the other day, when they got themselves into a wild card position, I said, all right, go get the Braves. And I talked about this series getting close so that maybe by the end of this series, the Mets could be neck and neck with the Braves. I did not think that 2 games into this series against the Braves, the Mets could actually finally jump ahead of them. It's been an amazing run. And this game, like I said, felt like a party through the first part of it. Early, the Braves did take a lead. Kodai Senga gave up a 2-run homer in the second inning. But prior to that, he opens up his start with a strikeout on a ghost fork, first batter that he sees, which is Jared Kelenic. He then got a ground out. Then, in the first inning, decided to drill Marcell Ozuna. That's a good way to face a batter, let them get on base. If you're going to have a Brave get on, you might as well drill Ozuna. Then he froze Matt Olson with the slider to get a strikeout to end that inning. He ended each of the first 5 innings with a strikeout. That is how you get a home crowd on your side in a return. The Mets then gave him a ton of run support in the bottom half of the 3rd inning. Tyrone Taylor reaches on an error by Austin Riley. Francisco Lindor gets hit by a pitch. Brandon Nimmo draws a walk. All this, of course, against Charlie Morton, which loads the bases for JD Martinez. JD actually nearly grounded out, but a ball went foul that allowed him to extend the at-bat. He gets a fastball, outer half, or a sinker. Goes with it. Hits a grand slam. So now the whole crowd's rocking. The Mets grab the lead right on back. After Pete Alonso grounds out, Jeff McNeil rips a double because, of course, he did. He's just going to get an extra base hit every game now, it seems like. Mark Vientos then gets a hanging curveball. He puts it into the seats. Now it's 6-2 Mets. Then Francisco Alvarez says, let's go back to back. He gets a hanging curveball. He puts it in the seats. 7-2 Mets. And from that point on, Kodai Senga was absolutely shoving. He shut down the Braves in that following inning. Perfect frame with 2 strikeouts. retired the side in order again in the 5th, and was well on his way to doing it in the 6th inning. His pitch count was manageable. He was at 69 pitches through 5 with 9 strikeouts. First batter in the 6th, he gets a pop out. And as he's trying to get away from it, because it was right past the mound, he's running away from the ball, he ends up crashing to the ground with a calf strain. Now, we'll talk about that injury a little bit more in the next segment. But I was riding high, as all of you were, and I'm sure I can't even imagine the emotional swing in that ballpark. But I literally was watching this game when I was on the plane. I wasn't able to stream it, but I was able to listen with shout out to JetBlue, very good Wi-Fi that allowed me to be on social media for a 5.5-hour flight, to be on subtext with our Locked On Mets insiders throughout that flight, catching up on a week's worth of text. So there was a lot going on through that plane, and I got off and I went right to luggage claim, and I recorded a short for YouTube and for social, basically breaking down the Stanek trade and talking about the plan for tonight for the recordings I was going to do. And as soon as I go to post it, I see the Senga injury, and it definitely dampened things a little bit. I think we still have to celebrate the fact that this Mets team, with now just a tiny bit of Kodai Senga contributing, has been able to make this incredible run up the standings. And I think they can clearly keep winning without him because they've done it all year. But it felt like prior to that, the New York Mets had come into their own as a contender, that they were in the top wild card spot. They were going to pass the Braves tonight, and they had their ace back. And now with him out, a lot of questions arise again about what the Mets have with this pitching staff and what else they will do at the deadline. So throughout the show today, that's what we have to talk about here. In the next segment, what I want to do is I want to run through all the different roster turnover that we saw today. Because like I mentioned at the top of the show, there was a lot of transactions that happened before this game to get Kodai Senga onto the roster and to start to set things up, probably to make a lot of maneuvers at the deadline. So I'm going to go through that. What are the implications of this Kodai Senga injury? Then in the final segment, we'll talk about the Stanek trade. But before we get into any of it, a quick word from our sponsors. This episode of Locked On Mets is brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.yeah. With summer travel heating up, especially travel for baseball games, it's time to explore those U.S. cities you've always secretly wanted to learn more about. Yes, we're talking about your rival cities, and with hotels, bed and breakfasts, vacation rentals, resorts, and so much more on Booking.com, you might just find your perfect stay, even in your baseball rival city. Like I've been mentioning, I've been on vacation just recently, and I used Booking.com for each leg of my vacation, 2 different stays, all booked through Booking.com. We got some great deals. The accommodations were excellent, exactly what we needed. The right stay can make you a fan of any U.S. city, even your rivals. So book today on Booking.com on the site or in the Booking.com app. Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop, but as the playoffs have winded down in the NBA and the NHL, we just get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like I want them to, but FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want, because all I have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest in the world of sports, check out Locked On Sports Today, streaming 24/7 on YouTube. Now, we have no idea how long Kodai Senga is going to be out on this injury. For now, I would assume he's going to hit the IL, though, probably the 15-day IL, and you hope that maybe in a couple of weeks, that calf muscle heals right up and he's right back into the fold, maybe makes a rehab start or two, and can join this rotation at the end of August, maybe September. That's what you have to hope for. I think JD Martinez really was honest. As a player that's been around the game for a long time, he said, I hope he's back for the playoffs. And you really think about where you're at in the season, there's 2 months left here. You're at the end of July, you have August and September. This is that last push where you get yourself into a playoff spot. Luckily, the Mets are currently there, but you got to hold serve. There's a lot of teams that are going to be getting better at this deadline. And a ton of action today. The amount of trades. I'll tell you, I feel like it's my fault. I don't typically book vacations in front of the trade deadline, and I'm just lucky that I have a really good team around me at Just Baseball now that was able to, cover me while I was gone. I assigned a ton of different stories at the beginning of this week, and the other editors I have were able to sort of manage it, and then we got some great content going on over there. But I was blown away today about all the trades, even going back to last night, all the movement. Randy Arozarena traded. AJ Puck traded. We talked about those two deals on yesterday's show. Then today you saw Zach Eflin traded. And then, of course, the Mets make a trade. But so many things are happening. And that means that there's going to be other teams that are going to make some moves that are going to get into this race. So the Mets, while they're sitting in the top wildcard spot today, and that's awesome, you still have to hold on to it. And Kodai Senga, it seemed like he was going to be a big piece to help them hold on to it. Going into the day, you were looking at going into the game even. You get Ryne Stanek and you think, all right, that's one addition. The Mets just have to fortify this bullpen. Their biggest addition, as much as that's an old Wilpon thing, the injured guy that comes back is our big trade deadline acquisition. That was the case this year. Right in front of the deadline, you were getting your ace back. And not only that, he looked like the ace. He looked like Kodai Senga in prime form from last year, and you just envisioned 2 months of Citi Field rocking every time Kodai Senga took them out. A near sold-out crowd that was just in a frenzy as the lineup piled on all those runs, and Kodai Senga was absolutely dominant with that ghost fork and everything else, and it just sucks. It really does, because this would have been nothing but positive vibes today. And that injury just makes you question things. Not that the Mets can't make the playoffs or can't overcome this. They have done all the legwork to get in this position without Kodai Senga. But in 1 week, you lose Christian Scott and Kodai Senga, two guys that, again, really haven't contributed to what's happened here. The Mets haven't been winning Christian Scott starts. But we thought those two guys were going to play a huge role in the final 2 months, where they could ascend to being two of the best three pitchers in this rotation come playoff time, potentially. Now you're right back to the same rotation that you had that got you here, really. At the beginning of this run, it was Luis Severino, Sean Manaea, Jose Quintana, David Peterson, Tyler McGill, and then just recently, Christian Scott replaced McGill. That fifth starter spot was about to be filled by Kodai Senga, and then you were going to expand to a six-man rotation. What was that going to look like when Christian Scott went down? We really didn't know. It was already in flux. Jose Butto has made himself indispensable from that bullpen, but now all of a sudden, you got some questions. And the funny thing about all of this is I've been pushing back on this narrative for a while on the show, that the Mets were in the race. They should do the buy-sell. How many reporters were trying to float that as a narrative? Jeff Passan even just recently, put out his column about the Mets and talked about how this was a missed opportunity to not be able to sell. Man, how many good Mets teams have we seen over the last 2 decades that have played baseball this well for this amount of time leading into the break? And I love, who was it? Tim Britton of The Athletic today wrote a great piece about going all in and just about the opportunity the Mets had, that this is a team that is worth going all in on. We're going to be talking about that in part 2 of today's show. But the idea that the Mets, who are right in the thick of this race, and now they're leading the wild card race, would trade Sean Manaea to get some prospects back or to get bullpen help, I thought it was ridiculous. And I've been saying that on this show for a while, and now you see why it was ridiculous. Because in one fell swoop in a week, you lose both Christian Scott and Kodai Senga, and you don't know when they're going to come back. You always hope, it's short end. Christian Scott, UCL sprain. Kodai Senga, calf sprain. 2 weeks, they're both back. Do we really think that's going to happen? And so now you have Jose Butto, who, again, as I've said time and again, has become invaluable to that bullpen, indispensable. You need him. Now, do you need him in the rotation more? Tyler McGill's audition on Saturday is massive for the New York Mets. Massive. Are they going to make a trade for a starter? Are they going to have to trade for more bullpen help to cover Butto and slide him back into the rotation? The only positive out of this, and I couldn't even call it a positive, maybe it's a silver lining, I don't even know how to describe it, but the fact is you were going to have to fill a spot in the rotation anyway with Christian Scott going down, because you needed a six-man rotation for Senga. and now you just fall right back into a 5-man. But that puts more strain on those pitchers. So now there is more strain on Severino, on Minaya, on Quintana, on Peterson, on McGill, or Budo to hold up until you get Senga and or Scott back. In the minor leagues, Dom Hamill's been throwing the ball better. Had a great start tonight. Mike Vassell has really been throwing the ball well lately. Brandon Sproat is carving up Double-A. Could you tap into the farm to get a pitcher down the stretch? Potentially. You just DFA'd Adrian Hauser today. That's the funny thing. Not necessarily starter depth, but a guy that's been pitching well as a long man in the bullpen. Now he's DFA'd. The Mets didn't think that Kodai Senga was going to go down, and it's crazy now looking at the moves that were made today, but here we are. A lot of turnover on this roster. So here's what happened before Kodai Senga went down. Daniel Nunez hit the IL. Your best reliever outside of Edwin Diaz, or maybe just your best reliever, he goes on the IL with a right pronator strain. Now, that was after pitching back-to-back in Miami, if I'm not mistaken. Carlos Mendoza said the MRI came back clean, no ligament damage. They hope it's a short stint on the IL. But now you have arguably your 3 best relievers that have come out of nowhere this year for this Mets team. Nunez, Reed Garrett, and Sean Reed-Foley all on the IL. The good news is you should get all of them back, and that's going to be a big lift to your bullpen. Adrian Hauser, though, was DFA'd. Shintaro Fujinami was DFA'd. So who else is going to be in this bullpen? Now, to explain those 2 moves, Hauser and Fujinami, I think the thought was, all right, you're going to clear some 40-man spots because you're about to make some trades. And you had to make room for Kodai Senga coming off the IL because he was on the 60-day IL. So that now requires him to be added back to the 40, essentially. Hauser hasn't been great lately, had a nice run in the bullpen. And the timing of this is by doing this DFA now for both him and Fujinami. Here are 2 pieces that are now essentially on the block. Okay, they're on waivers. The Mets can trade these guys before the deadline. So that's what I would think might happen here with both of them. Maybe they're part of some other deals. Maybe, they're just getting you some cash back. We don't really know, but the timing of that was to clear spots because the Mets are going to be aggressive adding pitching. They also, when they got Ryne Stanek, they had to make another move. Josh Walker got DFA'd. So there's a lot of roster churn here. You look at where the Mets stand right now as presently constructed, their starting rotation: Luis Severino, Sean Minaya, Jose Quintana, David Peterson, Tyler McGill. McGill pitches well on Saturday. I think the plan will be to roll with that rotation and hope that you can keep Budo in the bullpen. But if you have to, you can move him back into the rotation. I think that's the plan, but I got to imagine the Mets are going to be checking that starting pitching market a little bit closer now ahead of this deadline to see what's out there. And that's going to be a big piece of part 2 of today's show, where we're talking about what going all in looks like. Is there a starting pitcher the Mets can go all in on? We'll save that for the next show, though. For the final segment, there's the trade to discuss. The Mets got Ryne Stanek. Who is he if you're not aware? We'll talk about it. And what does that mean for the rest of the Mets bullpen? First, before we get into it, though, another word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Supply House. Get supplies from the site that's made for skilled trades, supplyhouse.com. Supplyhouse.com is a reliable way to order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical products online with their easy-to-use website, which is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Get expert support and industry-leading service from the friendliest folks in the business and talk to a real person every time. Pros in the skilled trades can get a competitive edge by joining Supply House's free Trade Master program, where every Trade Master gets access to a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Join the thousands of trade pros already benefiting from their free membership at supplyhouse.com/T-M and order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies from anywhere with just a few clicks at supplyhouse.com. Now let's talk about the big news of the day. The New York Mets have made their first trade of the deadline. If we're not counting Phil Maton, which came a couple weeks before the deadline, they have acquired another former Astros reliever, Ryne Stanek. Now, if that name sounds familiar, the Mets showed interest in Stanek this offseason, and instead he chose to sign with the Seattle Mariners on a 1-year, $4 million deal. Now, the Mets get to circle back around to him. They pick him up as the Mariners had made a trade for a reliever earlier in the day. They acquired Yimi Garcia from the Toronto Blue Jays, a guy that I thought the Mets could have really shown some interest in, but one that would require a bigger prospect return to get. He was one of, if not the best, top rental reliever on the market. Well, maybe not the top one because you have Tanner Scott, you have Carlos Estevez, but maybe the top setup man type because the other two might require a closer return. Garcia was a setup man, a guy that has a really good strikeout rate, low ERA, pitching great this season. So the Mariners, they make what they view as an upgrade, and then that makes Ryne Stanek expendable. The Mets swoop in and pick up a guy who hasn't had the best results this year when you look at the ERA of 4.38, but the underlying numbers are good. His expected ERA is 3.44. He still has a bunch of strikeouts, 44 in 39 innings pitched. You look throughout his career, he has basically struck out 10 batters per 9 every season. And that means he's striking out at least a batter every inning, and typically a little bit more than that. He's had 2 years where he's had a strikeout per 9 of 9.9. Last year was at 9.1, but this year it's right back over 10. He's touched 101 this year. This guy throws gas. He's averaged 98.1 miles per hour on his fastball this year. He pairs that with a splitter and a slider. He shows a lot of energy when he's on the mound, and he looks like a pirate. Got flowing hair, nice facial hair as well. This is just an awesome reliever to follow. I think Mets fans are really going to fall in love with this guy quickly, especially if he has good results. And to me, it's the perfect pairing with Phil Maton. Very similar additions because they didn't require a lot to get. You're taking on some money for some other teams, basically. And yes, this one required more of a prospect. We still don't know if it's a player to be named later or cash that the Rays got in that Phil Maton trade. This is a prospect, Rylan Thomas. Funny thing about that prospect, I was texting the Locked On Mets insiders. And by the way, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. You can find a link in the episode description. Go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. This is our texting service. And so I was having a lot of fun catching up with the insiders after being away on the trip this week. And I was mentioning prospects that first I deemed untouchable. We'll talk about those in part 2 of today's show. And I also mentioned prospects who I'd be dangling at this deadline for relief help. And one of the names on that list was Rylan Thomas. So I sent out those lists to the insiders. And then about 30 minutes later, the Mets make a trade for Ryne Stanek. Then the return comes in from Andy Martino. Sure enough, Rylan Thomas. The reason why I love this trade is Rylan Thomas is not a significant prospect to trade. He's performed very well, had fantastic numbers in AA. AAA, he's been solid, but he has a ceiling of a fourth outfielder. Good defensively in the outfield, good bat-to-ball skills, not a lot of power, not a ton of speed. Just a good player who has put up good numbers in the minor leagues, but not a guy that it kills you to trade. And you get a guy in Stanek who throws really hard and has plenty of experience pitching in high leverage, also has playoff experience, 2.70 ERA in his career in the playoffs, won a World Series with the Astros back in 2022. Don't believe he gave up an earned run throughout that entire stretch, although he was not one of the relievers they relied on heavily. I think it was about an inning pitch in each series, but a good inning. Overall, though, I think this was a fantastic addition, not as the big move at the deadline, but as the first move at the deadline. I'm assuming the Mets add more here. If their entire deadline is they add Phil Maton a couple weeks early and they add Ryne Stanek a couple days early and they don't add anything else, not good enough. But if these are the first two moves of a bullpen overhaul that maybe adds 4 arms to this pen, job well done from David Stern. So I think this was a really good job jumping on a name that was probably out in the market today. Once they got Garcia, they started to float Stanek around. They had a prospect in mind from the Mets and Rylan Thomas that they liked. Boom, you make the trade. Love it. Now, what's that mean for the Mets bullpen? You got Edwin Diaz. You got Ryne Stanek. You got Phil Maton. And Jose Budo right now looks great coming out of that bullpen. You got 4 arms. Okay. Who else is in the mix? Currently, you have Alex Young and Danny Young, a couple lefties. You have Jake Diekman, who struck out 3 tonight but gave up a home run. You have Adam Ottavino, who gave up a couple hits and got bailed out a little bit by Jose Iglesias making a diving stop to end an inning, who has not looked good throughout the year, but I think the Mets like his veteran leadership. So we'll see if he holds on to a roster spot the whole season or if eventually he's a casualty. I think for now, he's safe until you get some of those hurt relievers back in Nunez, in Garrett, in Sean Reed-Foley. And then you have Eric Orsi, who very well could be sent down any day now, although because Kodai Senga is probably heading towards the IL, Orsi's spot might be safe for a little bit. I think the assumption was Orsi was going to go down for Tyler McGill, probably option him, bring McGill up. Now, I don't really know. Bottom line, though, if you look at this bullpen, there's 3 names that right now I believe will be pitching for this team for the rest of this season in the bullpen. It's Diaz, Stanek, and Maton. Budo would be there, but there's a chance you might need him in the rotation. So that leads to what the Mets have to do here before the deadline. They got to decide how much they believe in Tyler McGill. Saturday's start here is going to be very important for that. They got to see what's out there in the starting pitching market. If there really is nothing, which I tend to think that's going to be the case, maybe you get a depth arm, but I just don't know who they're going to be able to add at this deadline when it comes to the starting pitchers without giving up a haul of prospects. There's also not a lot of starters that are even available. So I'm a little bit curious if they can add a starter. If you're going to keep Jose Budo in the bullpen, you're going to have to add at least 2 bullpen arms. If you think Budo's got to slide back into the rotation, you might need 3. So the Mets have to be on the phones. They have to be aggressive. It's going to be really interesting to see where this team ends up in a couple of days. But what they have done clearly by winning 5 in a row here before the deadline, they have made it abundantly clear to David Stearns, you have a window. This is a team to invest in. Steve Cohen as well. And you know, Cohen does not need much convincing on that front. But Francisco Lindor is playing like an MVP. Damn well might win the NL MVP this year, the way he has been swinging the bat, playing defense, leading the team, everything else. Talked about that a bit yesterday as well. This guy looks like an MVP right now. Brandon Nimmo in his prime. Last year with Pete Alonso. Mark Vientos, Francisco Alvarez, playing really well as young players on the come up. Not to mention guys on 1-year deals, JD Martinez, Harrison Bader. You don't know how long this team's going to be together. It might just be this season, but this is a team that has enough to make some noise if they have enough pitching. So pitching is the top priority, and there's a big name that has hit the market, Blake Snell. In part 2 of the show today, I'm going to talk about going all in. What does that look like for the Mets? Could it be taking on Blake Snell's huge contract? We'll talk about that in part 2 of today's show. As always, though, thank you for tuning in. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Trying to make a push to 10,000 subs by the end of the season, so I appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider throughout this deadline coverage and beyond, find a link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen or your first watch every day. Now for your second watch, head over to YouTube and check out the first ever 24/7 streaming show covering everything in the world of sports. I'm talking about Locked On Sports today, which is also streaming 24/7 on Amazon Fire TV.